Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's webinar. We are excited to welcome all of you for an exciting night of unpacking the findings from the 2020 U.S. Census, voting trends in the API community during the 2020 election, the recent uptick in anti-Asian hate and violence, and the growing influence of AAPI women. Tonight, we are joined by a fantastic panel of experts in the field. We have a lot of ground to cover today, so we'll go ahead and get started with a quick tech talk. So for those of you joining us tonight, you see that this is a webinar. First things first, a couple of technology notes. You will be muted during this call when we are in the main webinar. During our Q&A sections, if you would like, we can unmute you so you can ask your questions out loud. Otherwise, you can put your questions in the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. You can also chat throughout the presentation or put your question in the chat box, although we highly recommend that you use the Q&A function so that we can easily find your question. If you have any questions or concerns throughout this meeting, let us know in the chat and we will do our best to resolve your issue. Again, thank you so much for joining us and taking your Wednesday evening or afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from, to join us today. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Christine Chen, to provide our welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Raymond. Welcome, everyone. It is so wonderful to see so many people excited about data and research. We know that data is one piece of the puzzle in dismantling the stereotypes and untrue notions about this diverse community. We believe tonight will provide further insight as we continue to unveil the multi-layers and narratives of the Asian American Pacific Islander community. For those of you who are new to this extended family here, API Vote is a national nonpartisan organization that works with local partners in over 28 states to mobilize Asian American and Pacific Islanders in electoral and civic participation. The 2020 presidential election cycle was historic for our community, and from making history by first attracting a presidential candidate who directly addressed the API electorate to over 1.1 million viewers at our presidential town hall, to overperforming voter turnout nationally. However, this historic year did not happen overnight, and API Vote and its partner network is proud to have played an important role in making this possible. The concept of API Vote emerged back in 1996 as a number of us realized that as the API community continues to grow in numbers, our political voice was not getting any stronger. It was because our voter registration and turnout was not matching our population growth. Since then, and especially in the last decade, API Vote was able to focus on recruiting additional local partners and building the capacity of nonprofits who are trusted messengers in our community to take up this work. Due to strategic funders such as the Coulter Foundation, for over a decade, we had additional resources to implement voter engagement programs every year, and not just for the midterm and presidential elections. We believe this evening will inspire you and provide you a better understanding of the API community. We are at a turning point in our history, and I believe that we have this chance to build a true political voice if we can take all the energy in the Stop Asian Hate movement and ensure we embed activations to register and turn out these new voters once again. API Vote and our local partners look forward to working with many of you as we continue to move forward. So speaking of partners, we would like to thank Comcast for sponsoring this program this evening. Comcast was one of the first corporate supporters of API Vote, and since then, they have continued to partner with us as we implement our Norman-wide Mineta Leadership Institute regional trainings every year, and early on our national survey work. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to June Kim, Executive Director of External Affairs at Comcast.
Thank you, Christine, for the wonderful welcome, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to all the attendees. And this is actually my first official speaking engagement in my new role here at Comcast. And I just wanted to say that Comcast has been a proud partner of API Vote since 2008, supporting API Vote and over 40 AAPI organizations all over the country. For many of us, 2020 was a year to forget. From the pandemic to the heartache and anguish caused by the racial inequality that started a year ago with the murder of George Floyd, to the rise of hate crimes targeting our community. That's one of the main reasons that I decided to take on this new role. And it's also because I believe 2020 is going to be marked as a historic moment for our community. The panelists that you'll be hearing from soon will talk about the fact that we saw a roughly 47% jump in AAPI voter participation from 2016 to 2020, which actually led to the first woman of color, and the first AAPI woman being elected as Vice President of the United States. Personally, I am looking forward to hearing from the panel about the AAPI vote and the pivotal role that it played in this election and will play in future elections in the United States. And I would like to thank the speakers here today and congratulate all of you, because it really did take all of us to see that huge historic jump in a year that all of us, again, would probably like to forget. And I want to congratulate all of you for being and playing that pivotal role in continuing to push our community to greater heights and greater political power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, June, for being here with us tonight. We, as APIA Vote, so appreciate the support of Comcast over the years. And let's go on and get started. So as you can see, our organization's reach through our partner organizations is expansive, covering 28 different states. And really, our partners are the star of the show. They are the ones working day in and day out on the ground to increase civic participation in our communities. We simply do what we can to equip them with the tools, resources, and trainings that they need in order to be as successful as possible. Remember, all power is local. We depend on our partners who know their local communities the best to take the lead on organizing their communities. So tonight, we are joined by a wonderful group of panelists here tonight to tell us about the trends from 2020 in our community. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Raymond. I'm the National Field Director at APIA Vote. Tonight, I'm joined by my colleague, Chris, who is our Policy and Research Associate. We're also joined tonight by Tom Bonnier, the CEO at TargetSmart, Norman Chen, the CEO and co-founder of Launch, and Jennifer Wong, the Deputy Director of Programs at NAPAWF. So when we talk about the API community, what are we talking about? Our community is not a monolith. Just like any community, ours is filled with complexity and nuances. The API community refers to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. There are over 22 million Asian Americans, over 1.4 million Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, over 50 ethnic groups in our community, over 100 languages and dialects, and over 12.5 million foreign-born residents. The census defines Asian as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent. Asian Americans are the fastest growing major racial or ethnic group in the United States. More than 20 million Asians live in the US, and almost all trace their roots to at least 19 countries in East and Southeast Asia in the Indian subcontinent, according to a Pew Research Center analysis of US Census Bureau data. The 19 largest Asian origin groups in the US differ significantly by income, education, and other characteristics. These differences highlight the wide diversity of the nation's Asian population and provide a counterpoint to the model minority myth and the description of the group as monolithic. Highlighting these differences within the Asian population has been central to debates about how data about this group should be collected by governments, colleges, and universities, and other groups, and how it can be used to shape policies impacting the diverse U.S. Asian population. The census defines Pacific Islander as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or other Pacific islands, including Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia. Oftentimes, the needs of Pacific Islander communities are not in full alignment with the Asian American community. And this is why it's so important for us to continue to push for the disaggregation of data at every level so that we can better analyze the true needs of each ethnic community independently of one another. So let's start this discussion today by just talking about some key demographic trends in our community based on the US Census. On the left side of your screen, you see that based on 2019 data, the AAPI population has steadily grown in every single state, minus Hawaii, at a double-digit rate. On the right side is a visualization of the same data with an emphasis on the percentage change in the AAPI population. Darker areas constitute greater growth than in lighter areas. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thanks so much, Raymond. So if any of these numbers start to go a little fast, no worries, we have it recorded and we can return to any of this at the end for Q&A. I just wanted to highlight, as Raymond pointed out, growth, which communities are the fastest growing, and that's Nepalese, Burmese, Micronesian, Romanian or Chamorro, Indian, and Pakistani. Those are by percentage. So you see Pacific Islanders, Southeast Asians, and South Asians are our fastest growing communities here. By raw number, it's Indian, Chinese, Filipino, and Vietnamese. And one thing I wanted to highlight within that is that our community's growth is largely due to immigration. So here I have highlighted the largest foreign-born populations by percentage, and also the communities with the smallest foreign-born population. Overall, 57% of Asian Americans are foreign-born. So it really goes to show which, when we talk about our communities, which how we outreach to them goes a long way. Another thing I wanted to point out here is also that our communities overall are pretty young and they're continuing to be more civically engaged. So if you see here, the Asian American median age is 35.2, Pacific Islanders 29.3, which is much younger than the median general population age of 38.5. If you see this broken down into kind of the census category age estimates, you can see that this is the 50% mark right here. And the general population, you can see Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are significantly younger when you break it down into those sections as well. So this means obviously that when it comes to voter engagement, we definitely do have to keep continuing engaging with youth and young adults. And while we also talk about our communities are young, they're growing, this isn't just the only reason why Asian American voter turnout and the numbers spiked. I wanted to point out this, which is the voter turnout, both from 2004 to 2020 for both Asian Americans ages 18 to 24 versus the Asian American general population. Obviously, we still have a young adult voter turnout, and registration is hard because there are always new eligible voters every 4 years, right? But you can see here that in 2020, there was a historic jump in terms of Asian Americans ages 18 to 24 and how much they turned out to vote. In fact, if you can see it even based on the general population, there was a much Asian American young adults, their voter engagement rate grew significantly and was actually the closest in terms of closing that gap ever since 2004. The closest it ever came was in 2008, which is obviously a historic election. So 2020 was a really remarkable year for Asian American Pacific Islanders overall, and especially for young adults. Passing it back over to Raymond.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. So let's talk about reapportionment. Some of you may know what that is. I hope everyone in here filled out their census form in 2020. Part of the reason that we have the decennial census is to determine how the 435 seats of the U.S. House of Representatives are divided among each of the states. Remember, the U.S. Senate consists of 2 U.S. senators from each state. The House of Representatives, on the other hand, works differently. The number of representatives each state gets depends on their population. And in order for a bill to become a law at the federal level, It must pass out of both the US Senate and the US House of Representatives and then signed into law by the president. So as you see here, several states in the Northeast and California are losing seats following the release of the final reapportionment data, which came several weeks ago. Meanwhile, Texas, Florida, Colorado, North Carolina, Oregon, and Montana are gaining seats in Congress. And in Texas and Florida, the influence of the AAPI community is growing, and it is incredibly vital that our community's voices are included in government. Elected and appointed officials make critical decisions that affect our everyday lives in every way imaginable. And it is vital that we be seen and heard. On this slide, check out the growing impact that Asian Americans have had on presidential elections over the last 16 years. We've seen steady growth in voter participation in our community. Between 2016 and 2020 alone, there was a 10% increase in Asian Americans who cast their ballots, with the total number of ballots being cast increasing dramatically. This is based on the US Census. On this next slide, this is another visualization of the same data that we saw in that prior slide, but honing in on 2016 and 2020 and examining Asian in the context of other major racial groups like white, Black, and Hispanic. As you can see, the percentage increase in voter registration rate and voter turnout rate was much more pronounced among Asian Americans than other racial groups from 2016 into 2020. This right here is a visualization of that same data, but indicating the total number of ballots cast by Asian Americans in 2020 as compared to previous election years. So as you can see, we saw a dramatic increase in the number of ballots cast in our community. And none of this happens in a vacuum. Not only is our community growing at a rate faster than any other major racial group in the country, we're beginning to truly awaken on a large scale to the issues faced by our community. And what does it take for our communities to awaken? Folks like you in the audience and folks like our partners working tirelessly to organize, register our community members to vote, and educate voters on the enormous power that they wield. Chris?
Yeah, thanks so much, Raymond. So here I just wanted to underline how really important it was that we had alternate modes of registering to vote and voting. If you can't see all this data, just focus on the green bar here. But here, what it's saying is that Asian Americans are less likely, according to in 2020, less likely to register to vote at the DMV or the registration office. We were more likely to register by mail or online by comparison. So this really underlines the clear need for policies that do make it easier for for everyone to vote, including automatic voter registration and same-day voter registration. This also translated over to voting. As we all know, there was major progress in terms of alternate voting options, such as early voting and vote by mail. And I wanted to highlight here, you can see that this yellow bar indicates how many of each community voted by mail. So in 2020, Asian Americans significantly used vote by mail more than any other racial or ethnic group. I also want to acknowledge that there are voting barriers for our community. These are some of the examples of when Asian Americans who didn't vote were surveyed in the current population survey. We were more likely to say that we are too busy to vote and understandably more concerned about the COVID-19 pandemic. There wasn't a clarification on whether that was of anti-Asian sentiments or health concerns, both of which are valid, but that was one of the questions that was here for the first time in 2020, unfortunately. We were also more likely to say in 2020 that we had registration problems, but also less likely to say that we weren't interested or we didn't like the candidates or campaign issues. So this does go to show that especially with the huge jump in being too busy to vote, we need to educate voters on early vote options and those vote by mail options like we talked about. I'm going to switch tack a little bit and talk about the Asian American Voters Survey. Biannually from 2014 to 2020, API Vote has worked with API Data and AHAC to do some surveys on Asian American voter preference over the 6 major ethnic groups. So I'm going to dive into some of that data and some of the trends inside of it real quick. Most notably, I want to talk about community outreach. Over the past 6 years or so, both Democratic and Republican outreach to Asian American communities has increased. And across the majority of the communities, Republican outreach has increased more than Democratic by percentage as they attempt to play catch up. So in 2013, there was this pretty well-known quote that Jeb Bush stated that the GOP's canary in the coal mine is their Asian American voting bloc. And from there, the Republicans this decade invested significantly more in Asian American communities. The Democratic Party, on the other hand, has been working since the 90s, has hired AAPI staff to conduct AAPI outreach. And I just want to also highlight that obviously we know political parties aren't the only people reaching out to our communities. Their community organizations and nonprofits they've matched this political party outreach in many circumstances across many different communities, sometimes even more so, despite those limited resources. I wanted to highlight that 1% of foundation funds and less than 1% of corporate funds go to AAPI nonprofits and community organizations. And with that in mind, here are some of the trends. There are many trends, but I just wanted to point out some of the key ones here. You can see that, as I said, Asian American young adults are a key demographic. And from 2016 to 2020, the Republican Party significantly grew that investment and is closing the gap in outreaching to young adults. They have also improved significantly in reaching out to naturalized citizens as opposed to US-born citizens. And in 2020, they actually managed to surpass the levels of Democratic and community outreach. On the other hand, even though I don't have the graph here, Democratic and community organizations were more successful in reaching out to US-born Asian Americans. So this is something to keep in mind for community organizations here in terms of which communities are being successfully outreached to. Obviously, we also want to talk about party ID. Overall, we know that a plurality of Asian Americans over the years have identified as Democratic, and there's also been a significant number of independent voters. Over time, over the past few years, this independent party ID has shrunk while both the Democratic and Republican ID has gone up. On the other hand, I also want to highlight that Vietnamese and Filipino American voters have had the greatest Republican Party increase over 8 years. And Vietnamese is the only ethnic group out of the main 6, starting in 2018, with a plurality of Republican voters. And wanted to highlight here that the biggest independent voter decrease were Chinese Americans over the same duration of time. Most notably, we also were able to survey voter behavior. One thing that we know is huge in this past decade and has grown is social media. So as I said before, we know that youth and young adults are very important here. So the number of young adults who talk to their family or friends about politics has significantly decreased from 2016 to 2020. You can see this decline in the amount of blue, while the number engaging online about politics has stayed constant. That's not just a youth thing. In 2020, we noticed that Indian Americans and Filipino Americans are the most involved groups online politically, with 37% of Indian Americans using Facebook and Twitter, 34% of Filipino Americans doing the same, and 42% of Indian Americans using WhatsApp to post about politics. So I just want to highlight some key data points from this to really understand what has happened or what trends are going on in the Asian American community and where they're continuing to grow. So now I will pass it back. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. We are running a little bit behind, so we're going to jump right into our next section. Tom Bonnier, the CEO of TargetSmart, is going to present his research on the AAPI electorate from 2020. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to it at the end of the presentation. Go ahead, Tom. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Raymond. Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So I'm going to jump right in and follow the trend of sharing some exciting data. As Chris said, I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you, similar to their great presentation. And so again, you can go back. I might go through some of these a little bit quickly. And also if you have questions, again, we'll have a little bit of time at the end. So what I'm going to talk about is primarily the 2020 electorate, and looking at the 2020 electorate and just looking a little bit deeper under the stats that Chris and Raymond just shared. What this is based on really quickly, and looking at this map here, it's similar to the map that Raymond shared, and that this is looking at the growth in the AAPI electorate between the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections, percentage growth. We'll get into some more raw numbers. But what I want to mention in terms of the numbers, this comes from individual level vote history as reported by the states and local election officials. So this is the actual data from the 2020 electorate and then viewed in the context of prior elections. So I'm going to start at a very high level here, just a snapshot of the electorate and looking at the AAPI electorate in comparison to the general electorate overall, everyone who voted. As we know, we had record-setting turnout, almost 160 million votes cast overall nationally. And so, you see most of these categorizations, I don't think will be all too surprising. The AAPI vote is much more urban and suburban focused than the electorate overall, where you see the overall electorate is roughly evenly divided with a slight advantage to the suburbs, whereas the AAPI vote, 64.5% of AAPI voters who cast a ballot in the 2020 election were in urban areas, almost a third were in suburban areas, very few in rural communities. From a partisan perspective, and this lines up with what you saw in just the last couple of slides, based on modeled partisanship, there's a significant Democratic advantage, about a 57-point advantage among those AAPI voters who cast a ballot in the 2020 election, as opposed to the overall electorate. This is just party ID. This isn't candidate support. Much closer, 1.4% difference. And then in terms of actual party registration for those states that have it, again, you see almost a 3-to-1 advantage among AAPI voters for Democrats, whereas among the overall electorate, the Democratic advantage in registration is less than 5 points. And then finally, again, lining up with some of these demographics we've seen, the AAPI electorate from the 2020 general election was younger, as has been noted, as one of the fastest growing, as the fastest growing group in this country. It's not entirely surprising to see that almost 17% of the 2020 AAPI voters are under the age of 30, as opposed to only 13.8% of all voters overall, and therefore, conversely, only 21.5% over the age of 65. So I'm going to share a few slides. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but I want to show you rankings. This is actually just the map and graph form. So it shows you the percent increase. And as Raymond mentioned, when you look at the percentages, South Dakota is number one. But what that means in South Dakota is that you had a few hundred AAPI voters in 2016, and you had a couple hundred more. So from a percent increase, it was an over 100% increase. The number of AAPI voters between 2016 and 2020 more than doubled, but that in raw terms was not that significant of an expansion. When you look across the top 10 or so states, though, and you'll see a repeating theme here, Georgia is number 2. And I'll dig a little bit deeper on this, but it's safe to say that the surge in turnout among AAPI voters in Georgia was decisive, not only in the presidential election outcome, but also in the U.S. Senate runoff elections, and Democrats gaining both of those seats. You see Texas number 4, Nevada, Arizona, obviously these key, critical, crucial states in the presidential race, and also in some key statewide races where you saw the biggest percent surge in AAPI vote. So overall, what that add up to? AAPI turnout increased by almost 46%. You had 46% more AAPI voters voting in the 2020 election than voted in the 2016 election, whereas among all other voters, that increase was only 11.9%. So the AAPI increase was almost 4 times the national average. This slide here looks at the change in actual terms of vote share. What share of the electorate, what share of ballots cast were from AAPI voters in 2016 and 2020. This is looking at the change between the two. So this takes out the factor of South Dakota that we saw on the last slide. So you see California, not altogether surprisingly, had the biggest increase, where API voters increased their share of the electorate by 1.8 points. Now, while these numbers overall may seem relatively small, when you consider the fact, as we've seen in the previous research, API voters were perhaps better than 2-to-1 Democratic in the elections in 2020. In many of these states, we're looking at something that was potentially decisive in terms of the margin. And again, Georgia, number 2, where API voters increased their share of the electorate by just over a point. Again, similarly, you see states like Nevada, Texas, Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, key important states where API voters were not only seeing a significant percent increase, but almost more importantly, seeing a substantial increase in their share of the electorate. This slide here is looking at what percent of the API voters in 2020 didn't vote in the 2016 election. As a key component from the perspective of Democrats looking at how do we change the electorate from the electorate in 2016 that elected Donald Trump, the big question was bringing new voters into the fold. API voters led the way in this context. In places, DC leads the way. Here, again, a relatively small share of the electorate, but almost 80% of the API voters who cast a ballot in DC didn't vote in the 2016 presidential election. And again, when you see some of these key states, Nevada, Georgia, Wisconsin even occupying the top 10, that says it all. So almost half of the API voters who voted in the 2020 general didn't vote in the 2016 general. Among all other voters, that was less than a third, 31.9%. A couple more here, and I apologize for going through these so quickly, but we've got a lot of other great presenters, great data to share here. So this is looking at this slightly differently now. We're looking at what percent of those voters, API voters, voted for the first time in a US election, period. This means they didn't vote in the presidential primary, didn't vote in any previous election, local, state, federal. And the numbers are really, again, quite striking. You see Texas there, number 2, where just over 40% of the API voters who cast a ballot in the 2020 general election in Texas were voting for the first time in their life. And so again, when you look at this broken down from a national perspective, almost 1 in 4 of the API voters who voted in the 2020 general had never voted before. That's almost double the percentage that we saw nationally among all other voters at 12.2%. This here is actually looking at, and I alluded to this a minute ago, well, what if you looked at the increase in turnout among just API voters between 2016 and 2020 and viewed that in the context of the presidential election margin to say, well, could we say these voters truly were decisive? And again, in Georgia, the answer is a resounding yes. The surge in API turnout was more than 5 times the eventual almost 12,000 vote margin for the Biden-Harris ticket. That dwarfs other states. But again, when you look at these other states, Arizona almost matching the margin, Nevada, North Carolina, again, you're seeing significant numbers. 2 more quick points I want to make, and then I will pause. An important point to consider, and Chris and Raymond pointed this out quite well. I want to view this in the context of the Georgia Senate runoff elections, just keeping in mind that in the end was what gave Democrats control of the Senate. We talk about the API vote. Yes, the API community, API voters are among the youngest voters from a demographic perspective nationally. But when we look at the surge was, yes, driven by younger voters, 18 to 29-year-olds here. You see this massive surge relative to the 2016 presidential election. But you see the other end where this was also driven by older voters, where API voters over the age of 75 effectively tripled their turnout from the 2016 presidential election. That's remarkable. And that's the sort of thing I have been working in election data analysis for the last 27 years, believe it or not. And I can tell you, I've never seen numbers approaching any of these. So the last slide that I'll leave you with, this is looking at what share of the electorate by congressional district were API voters in the top 50 congressional districts in the country by this index. And so you see, not surprisingly, Hawaii, where 59.3% of those voters who cast a ballot in the 2020 general election were API. But you see, again, not surprisingly, a lot of California districts, but you also see New York districts, Texas districts in the top 25, Virginia, New Jersey, Georgia. You see that this growth is happening everywhere, even in Maryland, Nevada. There are multiple Texas districts. And, obviously we know as we look at this list, most of these districts aren't currently represented by AAPI representatives. I think there's significant potential here. Also keeping in mind that this is looking at the general electorate. If I were going to share these statistics for the Democratic primary, in many of these districts, if not most of them, API voters would account for a majority of Democratic primary voters. So I'm going to take a breath and hand it back over. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tom. We actually have a question for you.
Great.
If you would answer this for us. The question is from Darina Wong, and it is, how do you determine the Asian and disaggregated Asian voters, since that is not collected when one votes?
Yeah.
And then she said, by surname?
Thank you so much. So that's a wonderful and important question, and really hits on, and I will give a very quick answer, but I'd be happy to talk about this more at length later on. And Raymond and Chris alluded to this. I think one of the areas where, frankly, we need to see more investment is in API data specifically around identifying these communities. And as Raymond said, recognizing that they aren't monolithic. At this point on the voter file, we don't have good sources of data to define nation of origin, to define language preference, generational status. We're working on that. There's some great leaders in this community I've been speaking with, many of whom are on this call now, and I so appreciate their leadership. So the data that we have is based on self-reported data in states that have it, like Georgia, Texas, and a handful of other states. And in other places, it's modeled. And as the questioner alluded to, in most places, it's based on some combination of surname dictionaries, census data, and a few other data points. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you.
All right. So at this point, we are going to move on with our program. And I am going to turn it over to Mr. Norman Chen, the CEO and co-founder of Launch, to share his findings with us. Here we are.
Great, thanks, Raymond. And thanks to API Vote for having me on this distinguished panel. Very quickly, I'm a co-founder and CEO of Launch, and that's with 2 A's. We are a relatively new nonprofit organization focusing on Asian American issues. And one of our first projects was working with Christine in the key battleground states like Pennsylvania to get the vote out with a digital marketing campaign. We were delighted to have the opportunity to get to know Christine and her wonderful organization. Our second project is the Status Index, which is a measurement of perceptions towards Asian Americans that can lead to racism and violence. It's a study that we commissioned and we executed in April of this year, and has some very interesting results that I'll share with everybody. Next slide, please. So when we saw and we heard about the terrible hate crimes last year, we, like many others, were very disturbed. And we wanted to try to understand better what are the underlying causes of these hate crimes and attacks. And there, if you look at hate crimes research and frameworks, there's a very distinct pattern of how stereotypes initially may appear benign, but during times of crisis can lead to scapegoating and even, unfortunately, violence. And that's what we're seeing affecting the Asian American community. So we wanted, again, to look at research about stereotypes of Asian Americans in the US. And unfortunately, there hasn't been a comprehensive national study of stereotypes towards Asian Americans since 2001. So we talk about decades and changes in America with the Asian American population. No one has really done a comprehensive study of stereotypes of our community in nearly 20 years. So hence we thought the status index would be very important and necessary. Next slide, please. So the goal of the status index, and again, it's the social tracking of Asian Americans in the US, or to create a baseline of Asian American status, how we're perceived today in 2021, to increase the awareness among the general population of our status, share this data to the community and to community leaders, help to develop new programs based on the data. Without data, you can't really measure progress. And lastly, to educate the public. Next slide. So a little bit about the methodology for the study. We conducted a study with nearly 2,800 US residents in all of the 50 states, all adults, general population study, so all races. We conducted it again in end of March, early April this year, so the data is very fresh with our partner Savanta Research. The sample was drawn and weighted to reflect the actual US population distribution by race, age, gender, education, and region. The results are highly accurate with plus or minus 1.9% margin of error. And in total included 39 questions conducted online over a 15-20 minute period. Our inspiration for this study was a study by the Anti-Defamation League that they've been doing since 1964, which is about American attitudes towards Jewish people. Next slide. So today, in the interest of time, we're just going to hit some of the main buckets of outcomes from our research and then talk about some of the specific data. You may have heard some of these results in the news, given that some of them are quite startling. So our overall takeaway is that the racism, discrimination, and violence that we're seeing today, unfortunately, in America, really stem from critical root causes, and we're trying to identify them here. Number one is that the Asian American community is disrespected and discriminated against significantly here in America. Number two is we are still defined by very toxic stereotypes regarding Asian Americans. And thirdly, despite our increased presence at the voting booth and also in American society, we still remain in many cases largely invisible. Next slide. So number one takeaway was that 8 out of 10 Asian Americans say they are discriminated against in the US. And I know we recognize there's discrimination towards our community, but to see the magnitude of that as offered by Asian Americans is really disturbing. And again, this matches some of the other recent studies by Pew and others about discrimination against Asian Americans. So there is some corroboration here. Related to that is the fact that 77% of Asian Americans do not feel respected in the US, which is disturbing because we know in Asian culture how important respect is. And to be in your home country and to live your life and not feel respected is really a shame. Next statistic that was quite revealing was that when you ask people how each racial group is treated, white Americans are recognized more than tenfold compared to Asian Americans as being treated with advantages in the US. So we are really disadvantaged because of our race. We were further surprised to find when we asked people, after all of the publicity about the Atlanta murders and all the hate crimes and attacks against Asian Americans, whether or not they are aware of an increase in assaults, hate crimes, or other forms of racism against Asian Americans. 37% of white Americans and 46% of Republicans said that they were not aware of increase in hate crimes over the past year. And this was really shocking. I mean, within our group, we actually wish we had done the survey earlier before news of the Atlanta killings was made so public. But even after that terrible event, over a third of white Americans were still not aware of increase in hate crimes towards Asian Americans. Finally, even when they are aware, nearly a quarter of white Americans do not believe that anti-Asian American racism is a problem that should be addressed. And ignorance may be one issue, but then the unwillingness to take action is another issue that came out of our study. Next slide. So that was the first bucket about racism. The second bucket are about classic stereotypes that really persist in the US still towards Asian Americans. And with this community, I'm sure we're quite familiar with the model minority, perpetual foreigner, and yellow peril. Some specific data points that came out of our study, when we asked people in our study to describe Asian Americans, the most common descriptions and adjectives were smart, intelligent, hardworking, which are really the same model minority stereotypes that have existed for over 50 years. We also asked how much people agreed with the statement that Asian Americans are more loyal to their country of origin than to the US. And 20% of respondents said that Asian Americans are more loyal to their countries of origin, i.e. not patriotic towards the US, which really is the perpetual foreigner stereotype and shows that it really still exists today in a fifth of Americans. We know that the terms like China virus, Kung flu, Wuhan virus persisted in the last administration. And still today, over a quarter of Republicans, 6% of Democrats, and 24% of people over the age of 65 believe these terms are appropriate for COVID-19. Lastly, we asked about how comfortable people are with Asian Americans as doctors or nurses, friends, coworkers, and there they were all very, very comfortable. But there was a significant difference in terms of their comfort level with an Asian American as a boss or president of the United States. Next slide. One major misperception that existed was regarding Asian Americans in leadership positions in the US. We know from data that Asian Americans are severely underrepresented in leadership positions. However, nearly half of respondents in our study believe that Asian Americans are fairly represented or overrepresented in leadership positions in the US. So a really strong, big gap between reality and perception. Next slide. Perhaps the most shocking result, and something that's been publicized recently, was about the visibility or invisibility of Asian Americans. We asked people in our study to name prominent Asian Americans. The number one answer by 40% of the people was, I don't know or none. 42% of Americans in our survey. Number two answer was Jackie Chan, whom we love, but is not American. He's a Hong Kong actor. And number three was Bruce Lee, who of course we revere, but passed away sadly nearly 50 years ago. The top female was Lucy Liu. So clearly a lack of awareness of prominent Asian Americans among the US population. We also confirmed or reaffirmed that Asian Americans are largely not seen in lead roles in Hollywood. They're mostly seen in supporting or backup roles. And the roles are still largely stereotypical, like a martial arts expert, gangster, sex worker, or maid. Next slide. So we are glad to see increase of awareness of the hate crimes towards Asian Americans. Obviously, there's still work to be done, as we've shown in our data, but we want to move towards solutions. And so we asked people in our survey, what would be good solutions for this? And these are the four main areas that came across. Number one, tougher laws and more protection against hate crimes. We're starting to see legislation being passed in this area. Greater awareness and public discussion about anti-Asian American attitudes and behavior. That's why fora like this is really important, and greater awareness through the press and other channels. An important next step is greater education in schools and communities around the country about Asian American history, and we're working on some initiatives there, and more inter-community outreach and allyships. So some very compelling data in the future. We intend to redo this study on an annual basis. We're coming out next week with a data playground so people can look at our data. We have over 100,000 data points and analyze and create charts based on whatever way they want to slice the demographics. So check out our website, launchwith2as.org, and see our report and further analyze the data. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Norman. We so appreciate the work that you do to collect this data and to interpret it. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm now going to turn it over to Jennifer from the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum to present their findings on the largest survey of AAPI women ever conducted. Is that right, Jennifer?
Yes, indeed. It's exciting. It's an exciting time, but yes, you're right. It is the largest to our knowledge.
Awesome. Well, you should, oh, awesome. You're sharing your screen.
Wonderful. So you should all be able to see a presentation. As Raymond said, I'm delighted to be here today to share our new survey findings with this group. My name is Jennifer Wang. I'm the Deputy Director of Programs for the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. I know we are running slightly behind, so I have shortened my presentation as much as I can. Let's jump right in. So at the outset, we really wanted to focus on the values and priorities, and of course, voting patterns of Asian American and Pacific Islander women. We worked with Harris Poll and SKDK, a communications firm, to speak with 3,537 AAPI women, self-identifying AAPI women, including mixed race AAPI women, using Census Bureau categorizations. We oversampled in Georgia, Florida, and Texas. This was an in-language survey. So in addition to English, we also polled in Mandarin Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. And like Raymond said, to our knowledge, this is the largest survey ever conducted in the United States of AAPI women. So we're very proud to have done this poll in coordination with the Harris poll and with SKDK. So right off the bat, the values and priorities showed that health and healthcare dominated the landscape. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, of course, there's a global pandemic. Health makes a lot of sense. Well, this is actually the second poll we have done. And in the previous poll, we also found that healthcare dominated AAPI women voters' concerns. You'll also note that right there, second to the top, that ending discrimination based on race, ethnicity, immigration status, sexual orientation, and gender identity polled very high. We asked some more specific questions about healthcare here that you can see. Even if you look toward the bottom, it's still a plurality of women who believe in some of these other important issues, like raising the federal minimum wage, providing visas to reunite families, making childcare affordable. So these are the top tier issues where AAPI women told us that they were either very invested in or extremely invested in seeing. So, COVID-19 without surprise dominated AAPI women's concerns. And specifically, they really wanted the federal government to address COVID-19. In particular, I want to point out how high Chinese Americans told us how much they were concerned about this. Second to COVID-19 was the economy, and third was healthcare costs. You'll also note that younger AAPI women were very invested in racial equity in this poll. We asked specifically how AAPI women have been affected by COVID-19. Many of them told us it had affected their mental health. In fact, mental health polled at the top of AAPI women's minds when asked about COVID-19. You'll also see here that pretty high percentages of AAPI women saw a close family member or friend pass away from the coronavirus. Almost a fifth of AAPI women told us they or a family member had lost their job. So stark information about mental health here, among other factors. So you can see in sum for this section, 3 of the 4 top issues across every demographic group center on healthcare for AAPI women. COVID-19 really affected AAPI women's mental health and continue to affect our mental health is what we're hearing. I'm going to move on to racism. This confirms a previous point or talked about earlier by another speaker. Around 8 in 10 AAPI women report racism has had at least some effect of their lives. We wanted to also, broaden the time frame in which we asked this question. So we asked them to reflect on the last 2 years. So this is about racism that could predate the pandemic, right? It could predate the use of China virus or of some of the other racist and xenophobic rhetoric we've seen. And we did that because we also know that racism has affected AAPI people and AAPI women's lives, since we, came to the United States centuries ago. And the pandemic has, I think, brought a new interest in stopping racism, sexism, xenophobia against AAPI people, but these are not new topics. And so that's why we asked the question that way. But these are pretty stark numbers. 78% have told us that racism has affected their life. And we asked deeper questions about what kind of racism. So you'll see here that 28% of AAPI women told us they were called a racial slur. Some told us they were discriminated against at work. Of course, we work intersectionally at NAPAWF on race and gender. And so you'll see here that the types of racism that AAPI women face are unique in that they are oftentimes combined with comments about their gender, so sexual harassment or violence because of their race or gender. So in sum, for this section, racism, both explicit and implicit, appears to be a regular part of AAPI women's lives, certainly a finding that has been confirmed by other studies earlier in this webinar. And more than half of the people we talked to said that they experienced specific instances of racism in the past 2 years, including things like being called a racial slur. So this is the exciting part of the presentation. We found that AAPI women were more motivated to vote last year than in previous elections. Certainly, as other people have said during this webinar, voter participation is growing in the AAPI community. That is also the case for AAPI women voters. The largest gains that we saw in this study were among Southeast Asian women and among, specific women who we oversampled in certain states. There's a bit of a factor here. The last poll that we did was post 2018, which was not a presidential election. So it's not a quite apples to apples comparison, but we found that compared to the last poll, AAPI women also participated in civic engagement in higher numbers as well. A lot of voting by mail among AAPI women. You'll see that 59% of the people that we talked to told us that they voted by mail. The interesting thing that we found as well was that President Biden won 7 in 10 AAPI women. His performance was the strongest with South Asian women, first generation AAPIs, younger voters, college educated voters, and Democrats. But as you'll see in the next slide, I guess I didn't include that slide, but I do want to note something here. While AAPI women did show up in huge numbers for President Biden, the interesting thing that we found was that they were not necessarily voting against any given candidate. So we asked, what is motivating you to vote? Is it that the candidate that you're voting for shares your values and priorities, or are you motivated and showing up to vote because you're angry about a different candidate and, really coming out in opposition to another candidate? And by and large, they told us that they were motivated to vote because they wanted to vote for someone as opposed to against a candidate. I'm going to skip this because I know we're short on time. Large majorities of AAPI women want to see more AAPI people and women represented in government and running for office. Texans told us that they really wanted to see more women in AAPI representation in politics. No surprise here. And more than 8 in 10 AAPI women really wanted their elected officials to know that there are differences between AAPI people's values and priorities and white people's values and priorities. So, the question we asked was, elected officials need to understand that there are differences within the AAPI community. Not everyone thinks the same, right? We are not a monolith. 85% of people agreed with that. And as an AAPI woman, I want my elected officials to understand how I differ from their white women constituents. Would be remiss to not mention Georgia here. So this is what I talked about earlier, that women, AAPI women that we talked to were actually doing things in becoming civically engaged in ways that we haven't necessarily seen in great numbers in previous elections. So this 52% figure here, all the way on the left, where we asked people, what were your political activities in the past year? The fact that 52% of AAPI women watched a political debate is actually, if you do voter work, that's actually a huge number. And that's not necessarily the case in our previous voter work, right? It's not every day that you see a figure that high. And so something was really motivating people, and in particular in Georgia, and I think we all know why. On average, we found that AAPI women in Georgia were the most engaged and significantly more likely to be volunteering on a campaign, to be watching political debates, to be sharing information with the people in their lives about candidates and elections. So 2/3 of Georgians reported voting for in the U.S. Senate race in November, and that jumped to 75% in January. So there was a huge jump between the November election and the January runoff. And they favored mail in November, but voted early and in person in the runoff. Huge stakes there, and great to see the motivation confirmed in the data. And this is what I was talking about a little earlier. So more Georgian AAPI women reported voting for at least one Democrat in the runoff than voting for Biden in November. So Georgians really swung more progressive in the runoff. And again, this just in some AAPI women in Georgia were very, very politically engaged, far more likely to volunteer or participate in campaigns than we've seen before. And voter turnout increased between November and January, and support for Democrats was stronger in the runoff. I'll stop there. I know we are very behind. Thank you all so much.
Awesome. Jennifer, thank you so much for being here. And with that, I just want to thank all of our panelists again, Norman, Tom, Jennifer, Chris, Christine. Thank you all for being here and for sharing your expertise with everyone. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and we are going to try and get to them all. I know we are actually over time, but we'll take a couple of minutes to answer some of these questions. The first one, I am going to punt over to my colleague, Christine. The question is, some people receiving phone calls, and I'm assuming we're talking about phone banking here, may be offended receiving calls in another language when their English is so good to high level. Yet Spanish language phone banks seem to work. Can you give us your thoughts? This impacts how out-of-state volunteers can help.
Yes. So for what we found is that in-language materials is still very crucial, because we conducted with our partners a mailer to 700,000 households. And in addition, with our partners, we conducted text banking, phone banking, as well as received about 5,000 calls from voters that saw our hotline number listed. And we found that there were a lot of those calls were in language, and we had to answer them in Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, and a wide variety of other languages. It is tricky in terms of how you estimate whether or not someone needs the translating materials. But what we've done is that all of our mailers are in English as well as 2 other languages. So we try to do our best in terms of identifying what language needs that they may have. Obviously, as you continue to work with the voter files and our local nonprofit partners, enter new voter registration information into the database, we could continue to refine and target the specific voters that actually do need that assistance.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christine. And we're going to leave you spotlighted right here because I think you are well suited to answer this next question as well. What issues motivated so many first-time voters to turn out for the 2020 election?
And why I answer this, if Jennifer is around, I would encourage her to also come back to answer that question as well from the API women perspective. Once again, it really was a combination from the survey work that we've seen pre and post that it really stemmed from their experience in terms of the rise of anti-Asian violence, that also a lot more people finally realized the connection in terms of the power of their vote and those who are elected into office and how that's connected to everyday decisions that were impacting their lives. So I think it's really a combination of their experience during this 2020 time period. But at the same time, we've been doing ongoing work with our local partners every single year, and we've been moving that needle. And we saw that in the midterm elections. So we were anticipating that heading into 2020, that there would be an increase of voter participation.
Awesome. Jennifer, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll echo all of that and also say that this is the second time now that AAPI women voters have told us that going into each election, the stakes were too high to not vote. That is always a statement that people that we speak with, not only in this poll, but our previous poll, agree with in overwhelming numbers. So, I think that people certainly in Georgia understood that the stakes were too high to stay home. And, I agree with, what's been happening across the country with the rise of, racism. I think that certainly even before the Atlanta killings, there was ongoing, high levels of anti-Asian racism and sexism. And I think that a lot of people that we spoke with in mobilizing them to vote were like, we've had it. And so, we are a growing community. And I also think that it's because of a combination of many of these factors, including that there are organizations like API Vote, NAPAWF, and others on this webinar who have been doing this for years and have been playing the long game, and that people all over the country are waking up and demanding visibility and demanding results.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I have a question here for Tom. If Tom is still here, I know you're experiencing some crazy weather wherever you are, but I have a question for you from Cecil Fong, who is asking, did we see an increase in Asian Republican votes as well as Asian Democrat votes in 2020? Do you have any insights there?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Cecil. And I was able to get back on after power loss, but I noticed my camera's a little weird now, so bear with me. But yeah, so we did. We saw the surge in API turnout appears to have been fairly evenly distributed across party, and so that's something that we'll be digging a little bit deeper into. But it appears the surge in API turnout, again, was fairly evenly balanced. In the end, obviously, the margins were better than 2-to-1 Democratic, but those Republican API communities also did see surges in turnout.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. We have a question here from Gloria, and I believe it's being directed to Jennifer, but Gloria, please correct us in the chat if we're wrong. Jennifer, do we know if NAPAWF survey oversampled frontline workers by any chance?
We did not oversample frontline workers. We only oversampled AAPI women who lived in Georgia, Florida, and Texas.
Thank you. And then we have a question for you as well, Jennifer, in the chat. Here it is. Stephen is asking, has NAPAWF Georgia created a toolkit for their success? Do you have any insight to that? I know NAPAWF structure is, you don't necessarily work with the Georgia affiliate that closely.
We definitely have a playbook. 2018 in a lot of ways was a very big year for us, and we repeated a lot of our successful strategies and tactics in 2020 and 2021 in January. We're excited about the work. We definitely have strategies that work. I can mention just a few of them. What Christine said about working in language is deeply important. We hear from AAPI women all the time that we visit that it's the first time anyone who looks like them and speaks their language has visited them for any political reason, any electoral reason. We also hear that, you know, it's extremely important that they hear from people that they trust in the community. So we don't just do civic engagement work. We have campaigns that are going throughout the year. And so when we're talking to them about elections, sometimes it's the third, fourth, or fifth time that we're actually engaging with that person. So there's trust that's been developed because of our other campaigns, like our campaigns around healthcare, our campaigns around immigrant rights. And that's been a huge advantage for us at NAPAWF, the in-language work and the reality of investing in relationships over time with trusted community.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I believe that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much to Comcast for sponsoring our program tonight. Thank you to Norman and Tom and Chris and Jennifer and Christine for being our distinguished panelists today. We are so appreciative of your time and your expertise. Thank you to everyone who stayed with us past 8 o'clock Eastern to hear the rest of the presentation. Make sure to check us out at www.apiavote.org. Navigate to our research tab and see all of the reports, specifically the Asian American Voter Survey that we referenced today. You can also find Launch on their website. You can find TargetSmart on their website, and NAPAWF on their website and through social media as well. Again, thank you all for being here, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
The recording has stopped.